This almost became the worst deal of my career. The borrower was on the verge of losing everything, and here I was, the one funding into it. My name is Michael Chadwick, and I've been in the hard money space for over a decade, and in this video, I'm going to explain exactly what not to do, and simply how to avoid some of these major mistakes that this borrower clearly made in the process. Hopefully, as a result, make your next fix and flip that much more successful. So I'm sure you're dying to know what went wrong, and so let's build the profile of the deal. First, you had a property in a single family fix and flip, which is our bread and butter and really easy to understand. The borrower was buying a 1,700 square foot split level in a nice area that had tons of comps, both for its as-is condition, but definitely for its after renovated condition. And the borrower was coming to us with $175,000 construction budget to renovate this 1,700 plus or minus square foot single family house. So $100 a foot all day long, buying it right. The renovation amount is really, in my mind, conservative based on the square footage. And here we had a borrower that had a lot of experience and was a designer in the kitchen and bath world, really knew her stuff, knew the finish quality the borrower was looking for. We fell in love with that. We fell in love with the fact that the project was being bought right. We felt that the economics were there. We felt the profitability was there, and the borrower had the cash to put 20% down. So we were funding 80% of the purchase. We were funding 100% of construction, and the borrower's budget we felt was more than enough to get through a renovation of this size. At the time, she was buying it in the fall. It was going to be a great renovation over the winter and time the spring market. All was lining up perfectly. That until we got to the first construction draw. And the borrower had started demolition. It was because she had her mind made up that she was going to open up the floor plan. And well, we know what happens when you open up walls. You find things, and if you don't know what you're looking at when you're going in, when the walls are up, well, then you could put yourself in a really difficult spot, and that's exactly what this borrower did in this case. So here we are. The borrower just starts construction. In fact, they're only doing demolition. The borrower has an unlicensed contractor in there demoing. They're working throughout the first floor, and they come to demo the main wall that was going to open up the entire floor plan of the house and expose this beautiful new kitchen that the kitchen and bath designer / borrower was putting in, that we were funding. It's load bearing. The borrower hadn't done enough due diligence to know. Now they had to go to the town. They had to get engineering done, and they had to figure out how to run micro lamb beams across the length of the first floor to accomplish what the borrower had already started on, which was an opening of the floor plan. And what did that do? Well, first, it extended out the timeline right away. Hard money loans are 12-month loans, and they're interest only, and typically interest only on balance. Yet at the same time, we're funding 80 to 90% of the purchase price plus 100% of construction. So those construction dollars, while not being deployed and not accruing or requiring any interest payment on, we still have 80 to 90% of the deal funded at close, or of the purchase, funded at close, which is a significant amount of money. I mean, in deals outside of Boston, we're talking $1 million houses that are getting renovated and sold for $2 million. And so in this case, the borrower was paying $7,000 to $8,000 a month, going through a process to fix what was the crux of their entire deal, a beam that was not only going to cost more money, but cost money and time for the borrower to figure out. And it wasn't until the spring that she could figure out what she needed to do to fix it and get it fixed, and then start the renovation. So really, we know that, number one, the mistake, lack of due diligence. The borrower didn't have the right contractors in place up front, and they definitely didn't have the right contractors in place during the demo. So that would be the second mistake, right? Is they didn't have the right players in place to protect them into going into a deal that they weren't budgeting enough for. So while sure, they were buying this property at the right price, and we optically saw a budget that was more than enough to renovate a house of this size, we didn't see that there was a structural component that was going to come into play that could have immediately increased the budget, which would have made up for the discount or purchase price, I'll call it purchase price discount, or the reduction in the purchase price, or the fact that the market wasn't willing to pay the full ask and she was able to get it at a discount. Maybe that was because anybody that was walking in saw that there was going to be an issue opening up the floor plan and delivering what the market wanted. So at the end, right, didn't have the right players in place, or just generally really poor planning. And then finally, I think the lack of communication on my end with her. Once we identified the process, the issue, we knew what process she was going to face with the town and how it was going to delay. At that point, we needed to be more lockstep in talking, because that was an extended timeline that she didn't have the liquidity for, but felt in her own mind that she could bridge that gap. And at that point, as she was going in further and further into the deal, she was running up credit cards unbeknownst to us and incurring more and more of expenses outside of the construction escrow that made it really difficult on us. So what's the lender's role in this, right? I mean, we heard there was a problem with the first draw when the borrower demoed the load-bearing wall. I mean, that should have been a big clue right there that the borrower was over their skis. But we knew that the borrower was moving forward and talking with the town. There were no indications other than the fact that it was just taking a long time to get through the process, which in Massachusetts isn't uncommon. We were just simply getting paid current on our loan, and there was no issue, right? So as a lender, in this case, maybe I opted to put my head in the sand and just think that everything was fine, because we really don't have touches on these loans, because we're really just funding closing and then we're waiting for construction draws, right? So if there isn't a draw, we could go from funding at close to payoff and not have any real reason to talk with a borrower, right? So, but we knew that it was important to the borrower's strategy and to open up the floor plan. At that point, we realized that maybe the borrower was able to get it at the price they were able to get it for, because the people that were coming into this house, looking at it in the market, wanted the open floor plan. And maybe they saw something that this borrower didn't through their due diligence. So we could have basically stayed on this borrower right after that first draw and the issue on the structural and kind of monitored it, but we didn't. And it wasn't until, I guess, the spring, when we had hoped the project would have been done and when the borrower started, that we started to see that we needed to pay more, close attention. And that was simply because the borrower's timeline had been extended. So identifying the problem and sticking with it. We identified the problem, we didn't stick with it. I think number two, we could have at that point identified with the borrower that they were going to have a liquidity problem, that they were already, unbeknownst to us, putting materials and things on their credit cards. So they weren't completely transparent, but at the end of the day, we were getting funded, our loan payments, the project was moving forward. We could have at that point come in and tried to structure a solution to help make sure the project was liquid enough to keep it moving, because we as a lender want to make sure that you keep the project funded. Here at Asset-Based Lending, we pride ourselves on having super quick draws. In fact, they're virtual draws, so that we avoid an inspection, in fact. But the reality is that we know the importance of it. So we're always looking to structure solutions and make sure that we're working with borrowers. And in this case, without the communication, it was hard to know that there was a significant problem, or at least we didn't know how big the problem really was. So we couldn't really structure around it or give the borrower a little bit of leeway to help. So, and then ultimately, we did have to work with the borrower. And when we get to the final and the results in the next part, you'll understand. But at the end of the day, we had to come in, we had to give the borrower extensions. We had to basically accrue interest and make the borrower not pay interest for a period of time, simply to avoid default and foreclosure. And so ultimately, as a lender, we did identify a problem. It became more and more obvious as we went through the construction draws that the borrower got closer and closer towards construction completion. And ultimately, we needed to modify the loan, which we were happy and more than willing to do. Some lenders can be vulture lenders. I mean, we have private money guys who love to foreclose. Here we don't. We want to just make sure the projects are successful. And 9.5 times out of 10, we're going to just work through and restructure the deal so it works, so that it's successful. The project is successful, because ultimately our collateral is in that property, and we want to make sure that we preserve the value. We see it through the renovation so that it's at its maximum value, and ultimately, in the end, we're underwriting towards that ARV, that after repair value, in terms of how we calculate LTV. So we want this project to be fully funded, to be fully renovated, to be on the market at its best condition, to be sold at its maximum price so that we get repaid. And ultimately, our collateral value puts us at 70% or less on this bridge LTV loan. So at the end of the day, you get your three different aspects as a lender that I feel are important to the success of a project when there's an issue. As a lender, I believe, identify and acknowledge the problem and stick with the borrower and give give them the resources to be successful. You have to be willing to structure in or modify loans where needed. That can happen in the middle, or it can happen at the end, in this case, where we ultimately had to come in at the end and restructure, give the borrower an extension, work with the borrower ultimately to make sure the project was successful. In this case, it was compounding issues that really put the borrower in a bind, and we'll get into that in the next segment. So the borrower ended up losing about $75,000, and it could have been a lot worse. When I tell you, the project was probably $100,000 over budget as a result of basically the borrower having to rebuild the house from the inside out, having to engineer the new beams that were going to cover the entire length of the first floor. They had to redo the heating and electrical, and it basically just meant they had to redo the whole thing. The upfront due diligence basically ended up costing the borrower an additional $100,000 that we didn't realize she was covering on her credit cards at whatever interest rate until about 3/4 of the way through the project, when she stopped making loan payments. So the borrower was bridging it and was making loan payments. We didn't really realize. They got to the spring when they started construction, even though they wanted to be done with the renovation by then. They were now coming into the fall, 3/4 to almost fully complete with the renovation, but out of money, couldn't make loan payments, couldn't fund the contractors to complete. So we had to come in as a lender, extend the loan because she was approaching maturity, which meant that we were basically opting to not foreclose and to just basically give her the time through payment relief and a few extra bucks to finish the construction to get the project together to a point where it can be sold, so that the borrower could get basically what ended up about 150 grand back to pay back their credit cards, to pay us back, but in the end was in it for well over that. And I think, like I said, I think they probably lost about $75,000 in the end. But we're very happy to do that, because other lenders could have just flushed their equity and they would have been left with no ability to sell their house and to recover some of their investment. Now, not all, obviously. That's on the risk of the equity. We're funding what we can, and we're doing whatever we can to shuffle. Like I said, we don't want to own the real estate here. We just want to give the borrowers the means to be successful. And in situations like this, we're going to modify, give the borrower time, and do what it takes to get the borrower in a position to sell the property at its maximum value, so that we all recover as much as possible. Have you ever been involved in a nightmare deal? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how it played out. And hopefully, you were working with a lender who sees the relationship like we do here. My name is Mike Chadwick. I've been in the business for 10 years. The sponsor of this video is Asset-Based Lending. I work for ABL. We have great programs, but we pride ourselves on becoming partners with our borrowers, to seeing projects through. And not all projects go the way that you see them go on HGTV, on all these YouTube videos where these influencers are making million here, million there. They go wrong. And sometimes even the most experienced investors miss something. And we're here to help. And we're going to talk more about different scenarios like this in future videos. But listen, if you do like the content that I'm putting out, please like and subscribe. And yeah, I look forward to the next one.